This is Jay Michaels, and I'm a professor of media culture and communications. And I have been clocking fantasy, science fiction, and horror films and other ephemera for more than 50 years. And I'm here to bring you some fantastic television on the Boston Sci-Fi Channel. Now, when I say ephemera, that's a fancy word for memorabilia, for stuff, for all that great things that go along with this wonderful genre and the wonderful hobby that it is. And it's more than a hobby for many people. We're going to talk to somebody who it's their livelihood. Um, Now, when I say to you comic books, immediately you might think Marvel, DC, whatever. But there is a world that has never not been here, for that matter, is independent comics. Now, we've spoken to Patrick Hickey about Legacy Comics, the new independent label that he has started, and his characters. And we're going to find out much more about independent comics from this gentleman. I have Roel Toress with me, and he is, as you can see by his office, a writer and an artist in independent comics. Roel, how are you?
Jay, I'm great. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Please, you're feeding the fanboy inside of me. I have been collecting comic books since they were 12 cents. So I adore them. But I only realized the concept of the independent comic in this century, in the 21st century, because in my day you had Charlton, you had Atlas, you had Gold Key, you had so many other names of comic books, and we didn't realize independent. We just thought, okay, they're just not Marvel. um, Tell us about you. Tell us about your work.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks. I think one of the wonderful things about comic books is there's very little preventing you from making your own comic books. Basically, if you have a piece of paper and a pencil, you can make a comic. And I've seen kids do it. And that's different from movies. And even now, movies become more accessible if you have a cell phone and a camera in it, and you can get software. But if you want a production that looks really good, it's very much a collaborative effort with a lot of people and a lot of technology. And if you ever look at the credits at the end of a major Marvel movie, credits will run over and over and over again, and you'll just see so many names. Of course, it starts with the stars and the actors in it, and then the directors. But then there are all these jobs that people might not be familiar with, like grips and best boy, and then an army of people doing CGI and special effects. And making movies is a massive undertaking. And often it takes hundreds of millions of dollars in budget. And a comic book allows you to tell a story with one person and no budget. And what happens is the idea that you have a story to tell and you have these characters and you want to put words together with images. And that's how movies work. So, matter of fact, if you think of a movie, it's a moving image, but they're composed of individual stills on a reel. And then, you view them sequentially, and it creates the illusion of movement, but they're all just individual still photos, and they're put on film, and then you run the film, and now it's video. But a comic book allows you to do that, and where you put words together with images, and you can do it with one person with a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen, and you can create your own stories with zero budget. So it's very accessible, and it's a great entryway for people who are like, I have these stories I want to tell. I'm a creative individual. I have artistic ambitions. And how do I do this without recruiting an entire troupe full of actors and directors, people to do makeup and wardrobe and need of a budget? So I make my own comics, and I've taught myself how to do all the different parts of it. So when you're making a comic, you write a comic, and then you illustrate a comic, and then you ink the artwork, the pencil artwork, and then you put color over it, and then you letter it. And so you realize you can do this all by yourself as an individual effort. But also what learning all those skills allows you to do is that it allows you to be a great collaborator, because once you develop the full arsenal of skills, if you meet a wonderful writer who has a story to tell but can't draw, you can offer up your services and go, I'd love to work with you. You seem like a great individual, very talented, very creative. You've got a great story to tell. You can't draw it. I can jump in and do that part for you. And now we have a collaboration. And conversely, if you have someone who's a great artist but isn't as strong with narrative and dialogue and plot, you can go, listen, I can write that for you. Let me structure it for you. Let me put the story together, and then you can utilize your strengths and emphasize them and draw a wonderful comic. So I've been put in a position where I can write and draw my own comics, which means there's nothing to ever prevent me from telling a story if I want to, which happens often. There are a lot of stories I want to tell, and I say to myself, I can write it, I can draw it, I can ink it, I can color it, I can letter it, and then we can get it out there in the world, and no one can prevent me from doing it. There are no financial restraints or restrictions. There's no personnel restraints or restrictions. And then it's also given me the opportunity to work with so many wonderful collaborators around the world, because online, you can reach out to folks. So I've worked with collaborators that I've never met, that live in countries halfway around the world, and they go, here's the work, and we send it to each other digitally, and we collaborate, and it's given us the opportunity to make, as you said, independent comics, which means it's just random, regular people who don't have the massive machinery of a corporation behind them to help create and promote the comic books. The mainstream comic books, most often Marvel and DC traditionally, but also things like Image Comics and Dark Horse Comics, they're corporations. And what happens is that they have presidents and vice presidents, and they have CEOs and CFOs, and they hire people to make these comics, and they have contacts in the world of distribution so that all these books end up in all the stores, and so they're readily available to everyone. And when it's an independent comic, what it comes down to is individuals, and it's just people making comic books on their own who don't have that sort of support, like on a financial level, on a structural level, but we still find ways to get our comics out there. So we create our.
How do you do that?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So the easiest way to do it would be to just put it online and use social media, and just go on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, go, we made a comic, and we don't actually even have to print up. We don't have to have the money to print them. We can put them on a print-on-demand service. The most familiar print-on-demand service is the one Amazon offers, but there are a lot of places now, because of the advances in technology and the advances of printers. I'll go backwards. Historically, traditionally, one of the reasons why Marvel, DC, and Charlton had, monopolies on creating comics was you needed access to a printing press. And a printing press meant that once you create a comic book, you would create comic book plates with the art and all the lettering on it. You would send it to these printing presses, and then they would have these big, heavy machines that would stamp it on newsprint pages. And you could only create comic books if you were someone who had access to a printing press. And to have access to a printing press, you need a contract to distribute thousands of comic books around the country to make it financially worthwhile. Technology has developed, computers have developed, printers have developed. And what happened then was you could print out comic books at a reasonable level using home technology, home printers, color printers. And suddenly you're like, oh, this is one gate, that one obstacle that we can clear now. We don't need access to a printing press. We can start printing things out. But then you need to be able to get it out to people. And how much is it going to cost you to print all these comic books, to create stock, to create inventory? So there are now print-on-demand services where you say, people will purchase a comic and they won't print it until it's been purchased. So no upfront advance money has been spent creating inventory. Therefore, you don't need to put yourself at financial risk to create comic books.
That's so great, because I remember they used to do that with T-shirts. I remember it was revolutionary, where you could get anything printed on a T-shirt and you didn't have to get 1,000 of them like in the good old days. So
Right.
now it's moved that way toward comic books. Brilliant. Okay, so in your case, you have created, because I see your poster, you're the writer and the artist. You created an entire character this way.
Yeah.
You created an entire independent comic, and you put it online. Have you printed, or have you seen yours in print also?
Absolutely. So the arc and the trajectory is to start off with print on demand, and you make it available that way, and you realize that's the least upfront financial investment. The problem is it's also the least readily available to everyone.
Sure.
And so what I realized over the course of things was that creating comic books is really, really fun, but a critical component of being a comic book creator is distribution. And distribution is never glamorous. Distribution is never the fun part. Making the comics is great. Writing the story and drawing them is great. And what's happened was that over time, I said, it doesn't make any sense to create all these works that you invest years of hard work into if no one ever gets to see them. And again, similar to, people are familiar with the notion of movies and the distribution model. If you can get out into theaters, if you can get it on Netflix, if you get it on Amazon, people will go and see it. If you create a movie and you don't have any distribution, as wonderful as the movie may be, as much time and effort, blood, sweat, and tears as you've put into it, if no one can see it, suddenly you realize a lot of that is a wasted effort. And so we've moved from a process, myself and the people I work with, we realized we want to make the comic books, but we also want to make them as readily available as possible. And so we have adopted the exact same distribution model that the major comic book creators have also used. So we make the comic books on our own without the financial support and resources that the major corporations do, but we've adopted their business model of getting every book into the comic book stores, printing them up, and sending them around the world so that everyone can get their hands on them. So yes, my comic books have been—
Who's we?
So I work with a conglomeration called Bad Kids Press. And so Bad Kids Press started out of a comic book store called Kamikaze. Kamikaze won an Eisner Award for best comic book store on the planet. And the Eisners are the highest industry standard for comic books, which meant that the runner-up that year that they won was a comic book store in Barcelona. And so they consider all the comic book stores and say who's doing the best job supporting the industry, representing the industry. And in 2017, Kamikaze won the Eisner Award, and that was thrilling for everyone who loves Kamikaze and is part of the Kamikaze family. And Kamikaze, as part of their efforts to support the comic book community, also has a sister imprint that publishes, prints, and distributes comic books. And that imprint is called Bad Kids Press. And that was the imprint that I got involved with because I live close to Kamikaze. It's in walking distance. And when I realized they were gathering a community of like-minded comic book creators, we used to have what was called open studios. There was an open door policy. Everyone in the area who liked making comic books would gather together, sit down, compare work, talk to each other, network, socialize. Making comic books, especially as an independent creator, is often a very isolated activity. You sit at home, you have a drawing board, you're creating your comics, and you're not interacting with anyone, and it feels very isolated, and it can be very demoralizing. It could be hard to motivate yourself to keep going if you're working by yourself and no one's seeing your work. Kamikaze allowed these open studios. Bad Kids Press would get together, all the local comic book creators would get together. It was a very supportive environment. And to me, that's the best way to make comic books, sort of in a studio environment where everyone is sitting around, working together, encouraging each other. You see, there are other like-minded individuals who are motivated in the same way that you are. And so when I say we, I refer to Bad Kids Press, which is the imprint that I'm very gladly and happily involved with.
You know, it's really interesting you say that because that was the history of Marvel. Stan Lee had all the writers and artists in a circle in the bullpen, and they would shoot names and stories and whatever else, and that's how creation started. So Kamikaze and Bad Kids seems to be following that model. But pardon my naivete, that sounds really innovative. I'm not hearing now. I know a lot of comic book stores here in New York, and I don't think they have. Sometimes they'll have a convention variant. They'll have a different cover with their logo on it, but they don't have a printing company. They don't actually get involved in the creation. This is really innovative. Am I wrong?
No, I think so. I think that's probably right. You know, there are two different activities, and while there are similarities and overlap on them, you know, just because you're involved with one doesn't necessarily mean you want to be involved with the other. And so if you have a comic book store, your business is to sell comic books and to sell all the items associated with comic books. Creating comics often tends to be a very different activity that relies on a different skill set. And even here, Kamikaze and Bad Kids are independent entities, and they do different things. It's just that what happens is that in a Venn diagram with these concentric circles, the people who are selling comic books and buying comic books, and the people who, and another circle, are the ones creating comic books. There's often enough of an overlap that there's some creators who want to sell them, or people who sell things who want to make them. And I think that one of the difficulties and one of the reasons why you might consider it innovative and not enough people do it is there's barely enough time in the day to get good at one or the other. I mean, if you're tremendous at selling comic books, it's a full-time job. It's demanding, working in retail. And when the pandemic hit and people couldn't walk into your store just trying to survive, if you're a retail concrete brick and mortar business and you're like, people aren't walking in to buy their comics, now what are we going to do? So that's a very involved process, trying to figure out how to survive and stay afloat in that environment. And then if you're making comics, especially as an independent where you're doing everything yourself, that's equally time consuming. So what happens is, I think that comic book stores that sell comics and printers that, publishing imprints that create and make and sell these comics, a lot of that's very time consuming. And I think the reason why there's less overlap is people say, I don't really have time to get good at both, and that's going to make it hard. And so what happens is, if some people already have a natural inclination towards it, you realize there's overlap and you do time management. And the natural thing about it is, whenever people want to devote themselves to multiple activities, there's some level of sacrifice. And you just know it's going to be time consuming and you're going to have to carve out time to do one and the other. But that's true of any set of activities. If you work professionally and then you say, I also have to have work-life balance, you need to sacrifice time at work to be with the people that you love in your family. Or conversely, if you want to support your family and provide for them and bring home a paycheck, you need to sacrifice time with them to be at work and to put time into the job. I think if you work full-time as a comic book retailer, you might think to yourself, I really don't want to spend more time also making comic books. I want to do something else interesting, like go to a bar, hang out with friends, have a drink, enjoy a lovely dinner, socialize. It's all a matter of how much the idea of making comic books consumes you, how much you feel it's a necessity, that you're willing to devote even more time to your interests and your passions.
Now, I see on your wall, it doesn't have balance sheets and order forms. So I'm assuming your passion is creating these characters and bringing them to life. Tell us about your characters. Tell us about your signature characters.
Sure. So I have a book that's been released called Frankenrocker and the Jailbait Punks. And the basic concept behind it is, what if Frankenstein's monster formed a punk rock band full of teenage girls, and they get kidnapped and sent to another planet to help wage a war with the Greys, the aliens, versus the reptilians. So the Greys and the reptilians have been engaged in this endless war. The Greys have superior technology, but the reptilians are more vicious. They're far more familiar with war, and they have greater numbers, and they have greater quantities. So the Greys say to themselves, we need to recruit equally vicious, equally aggressive individuals to help us in the war against the reptilians. And what they do is they use a teleportation machine, and they send people to the planet Earth. And the first people they encounter is a punk rock band called Frankenrocker and the Jailbait Punks. And Frankenrocker and the Jailbait Punks are on stage and they're battling their audience, and they're clearly very aggressive and they have violent tendencies to them. And they say, these are the people who will help us win the war. And so they kidnap them, they take them hostage, they teleport them back to their home planet. And suddenly this punk rock band from dive bars playing indie rock find themselves at the forefront of this planetary war between gray aliens and reptilian aliens.
Where did you get such an idea from? What were you smoking that idea just came to you? Wow.
Great question. So I love B movies and cult movies, and I love sort of fringe outsider art and the things that are outside the mainstream. I just realized that if you're going to make indie comics, they should probably be indie ideas as opposed to mainstream comics. There's already a proliferation, there's an abundance of superhero material out there. And it's very hard for me to compete at the level with Marvel and DC. And if I wanted to do something that stood out, I just said to myself, I probably need something that's a little off kilter. And I had an admiration for all these people who would make movies that were just really out of left field and bizarre B movies and cult, and they weren't aiming to be anything other than a fun romp. And that's what I wanted to be. Was I just wanted it to be entertaining. I said, I'm going to throw every idea I have in there. So I want Frankenstein's monster in there. I want punk rock in there. I want planetary wars in there, the Greys and reptilian aliens. I just threw it all together. And I think I really have to give credit. One of the most influencing factors in this idea is that every time I create a comic book project, I try to determine the strengths of my collaborators and play to those strengths. And I try to figure out what they do best. And the artist that I work with, Lukasz Kowalczyk, is a fantastic illustrator who's great at drawing monsters and punk rock and aliens. And I said, this will play very much to his strengths. This will be in his wheelhouse. He loves doing things like this. It looks beautiful when he draws these concepts. And I said, let's go ahead and propose this comic book series to him. I pitched it to him. I said, here's the idea. Would you be interested in doing it? You know, he was someone I was familiar with and we worked on different projects together, but it was a big time and effort commitment on his part. I was very fortunate that he said yes, because he's a brilliant illustrator and a wonderful collaborator and a great guy. And so the idea basically stemmed from, you know, love of punk rock, love of horror movies, love of sci-fi movies. You throw them all together so that every element is represented. You get a great collaborator who can do justice to the premise, better than do justice. I mean, he exceeded all my expectations because of how wonderful he is. And then we just went from there. We put the story together, we let it play out. And yeah, so that's my signature concept idea, Frankenrocker and the Jailbait Punks.
Okay, now you're talking about the strength of your collaborators. There's the old expression, you have to know the rules in order to break them.
Yeah.
And I kind of move that over into this industry and say, if you got to be independent, you need to know what you're stepping away from and stepping into.
Right.
How do you know? Yes, you understand the strengths of your collaborators. How about your audience? Do you get into that commercial end somewhere and say, okay, will this play? Will this sell?
So what's fortunate, right, is because you're an independent comic and your budget is minimal, it's limited, you don't actually have to sell to a lot of people to recover your initial outlay. In addition to being a comic book creator, I spent many years as a Harvard financial officer. And I used to work for the CFO of Harvard College, Sally Hensley. And one of the things that you just take away from the complicated notions of finances is that you will always do well, you will be fine if you just remember your two columns and you take a look at them, and one is income and one is expense. And as long as your income is greater than your expense, you're going to be fine. And as long as your expense is greater than your income, you're going to be in trouble. So if you have a big, massive movie that does billions in the box office, but you spent 10 billion on your budget, you're going to lose money. It doesn't matter if you make billions. Conversely, if you only have 10 guys who buy your comic book at $1 a piece, $10, but you only invested $5 in the creation of it, that's a profit. So the question is, do I think about the audience? Will it sell? I don't need to worry about it too much. There's not too much anxiety and concern, because as long as I keep my finances, my expenses manageable, whoever buys it, I'm going to be able to break even. I'm going to be able to make a profit. Or even if I take a loss, I'm not going to lose my shirt because it's manageable expenses. So if you don't worry about the finances and you don't worry about the scope, the magnitude, the quantity, how many people are buying it, you can say to yourself, what's the most interesting, entertaining story I can tell? Because I don't have to worry about commercial success. I don't have to worry about economic success. So let's just make it internally gratifying and rewarding. Having said that, I love it when people buy the comic, and you know, I encourage everyone to do it.
It's interesting. Don Barza, who's an Emmy-winning producer, I asked him almost the same question about independent film, and he's and you're giving the answer almost the same way. He said, if you look at it in some way as a hobby, as long as you're having a good time, as long as you're enjoying and you feel fulfilled, sometimes you'll make money, sometimes you won't. It doesn't matter, because the journey is something you want to be on. Sounds like you're saying the same thing. You're gonna do it, and if you read it, that's great. If not, I enjoyed doing it.
I mean, I agree. I think that I wholeheartedly endorse that sentiment. You should never get into creation of independent comics to be rich or successful. Do it because you love it. Do it because you have to. Do it because you enjoy it. So the creation of it is its own reward. It's gratifying for me to make comic books. Um, there are a lot of people who their hobbies cost them thousands and thousands of dollars. And I know people who love to play golf. And, you know, the entire concept of playing golf means you have to buy a lot of equipment, but then you have to belong to these golf. And it's just an expensive hobby. I mean, you know, playing golf requires a financial outlay. I think it's great if you can have a hobby that makes you happy, that satisfies you, that makes you content internally, emotionally, spiritually, and it doesn't cost you a lot. But you also get to exercise the creative aspects, the artistic aspects of your personality. And so, I mean, sometimes I think about the audience. I'd love people to buy the comics. It it makes me so happy when people I don't know pick up my comic and read it and they say they enjoyed it. That's fantastic. That's wonderful. That I mean, I really enjoy that experience. It's a great feeling. But all I try to do when I make the comic is I try to find an idea that I like, that I enjoy, that I'm enthusiastic about. And I try to do it to the best of my ability. I hope it finds an audience, but I can't determine that. I'm not in control of that aspect of it. We just make it as interesting as possible and send it out into the world in hopes that it finds its own family.
The world. Do you look at have you ever gotten political? Have you ever spoken to an audience and they mentioned something, you read something in the paper and it just infuriated you and you decided the storyline is going to reflect this even as a parable underneath it? Have you ever thought to get the parable out there in your work?
Yeah, I don't even do that indirectly. I don't do that in figurative manner. I don't allude to that. It's not allegorical. I'll do that directly. I will go ahead. So for my background, I grew up in the Philippines under martial law, and my family left the country because of death threats against us under martial law. And so we came to the United States, and we were classified at that point. In 1981, I was 9 years old. The terminology they used was my mom was an illegal alien. Now we call them undocumented immigrants. And they spent years trying to deport my mom and my family, you know, and she hired lawyers. But what happens there is that you have a strong understanding of the political context of people's lives and the importance of elections and the people in control and authority and who's in the government. And so it's always been a part of my life, my upbringing, my entire existence. And what happens is that that these issues come to light and they become controversial and people take sides and it can be very polarizing. And I think immigration is one of the more divisive topics in this country. And you know, people on both sides feel very strongly and feel like that they're right. And both of them are able to justify their viewpoints. Some people say, listen, people can come to our country. They shouldn't do it illegally. Like illegal immigration doesn't make sense. There's reasons why we have rules in place. And other people say these are the folks who are in most desperate need, who are desperately trying to find refuge and a place that they can be safe. And we need to welcome them with open arms because that's the humane, compassionate thing to do. And I understand both sides. And, you know, I, of course, because of my background, I'm naturally predisposed and inclined towards one of the sides. But before I put out Franken Rocker and the Jailbait Punks, my previous project was called Border X, and Border X donated all the profits of the anthology to immigration resources, you know, south of the border, people who were crossing in from Mexico, and it all went to charity, and everyone contributed to it. It was an anthology project. We all put in our time and our effort, and we created this anthology book, and you know, we raised thousands of dollars, and out of the thousands of dollars, we took home none of it. We donated all to charity, and all of my comic books, I feel that they will not shy away of anything. They will openly embrace political topics. I don't mind that. I'm not worried about alienating people. I'm not worried about angering anyone. I think everyone has their viewpoints. I'm not going to win over people on the other side, and people on the other side aren't going to win me over. But my comics are an opportunity for me to express the things that are important to me, and I don't want to shy away from them. And I don't want to sanitize or sterilize my work in an effort to make it palatable to everyone. I just don't think that that's a recipe for success. If you have a creative voice, if you have a viewpoint, if you have a perspective, I think you should pursue it. I think you should do everything in your power to be sincere and genuine and honest and true. And so my comic books do reflect my viewpoint. And if people don't agree with it, I mean, there's certainly plenty of other pieces of entertainment and media that they can consume and enjoy. I'm not looking to be adversarial, and I'm not looking to make enemies about it, but these are just reflections of my own personal experience. And we're all products of our environment. And so because these are indie comics, they're not corporate sponsored. They're not Marvel, they're not DC. They don't have to do $1 billion at the box office. It's one guy sitting in his art studio coming up with a story. And so, it's going to reflect a lot of the way I see the world, the way I think of the world. And I don't mind that. I think, that's the way my comics are going to turn out.
You may be screaming solo, but the way you're describing what you have done for the plight of your mother, essentially, when you get down to it, that's how Marvel first started. When it was Timely Comics, how much of us remember the cover where Captain America's punching Hitler?
Right.
I read a book once called Up, Up, and Oy Vey, and it talked about the Jewish influence in the 1940s. And there were so many comic book artists that were children of Holocaust survivors.
Sure.
And so it was their catharsis, if you will, to punch out Hitler, to have Superman beat up Mussolini. It became this catharsis, and it sounds like you're operating the same way, which is wonderful. That's something which I'm glad continues in indie work. Now, you're saying indie, you're not the corporations and all of that, but let me ask you, would you like to see Frankenrocker and his gang on the big screen? You ever thought about turning it into a TV series, anime, cartoon, movies, anything like that?
I openly welcome any offers to distribute, and the greater proliferation of the concept and the characters. Here's what I'll say outside of those considerations, which is this: when you tell a story, I think you would like as many people to enjoy it and experience it as possible. And whatever medium can deliver that, I think that'd be great. And I would openly encourage that. So there have already been people like Frankenrocker, and the concept, the characters has already received some licensing. There's a wine company in France that's producing a wine. It's a Côte d'Oron 2021 vintage. And their understanding was like, they like the characters, they like the designs, and they said, we want to put it on our wine label and sell it for wine. And I said, that sounds fantastic. Please and thank you. And so they're releasing a Frankenrocker wine. I don't know anything about it other than the fact that I created the characters and that I did the comic. I don't know anything about the wine industry, but I'm happy to collaborate with people who want to use my characters and launch other projects. So they're now part of a wine. If people say we want to make cartoons or TV shows or movies about it, that's great. I have no opposition to it. I understand that there are different forms of media. I feel bad for someone like Alan Moore, who every time they turn one of his creations into a movie, disowns it and talks about how much he hates it. I understand that there are always creative compromises to be made in life, and that each medium is its own different, it has different requirements. And so something that you create as a comic book is going to translate differently into other media, and that's all fine. I openly welcome it. If people are interested, that's great. I'm not dismissive about it. I don't want to be elitist about it. I think that however people get to experience the story, whomever wants to turn it into a different form of media, that'd be wonderful. And I would consider myself fortunate. I consider myself fortunate to this point now that my ideas get turned into comic books and people can buy them and read them, and that's great. If people can also see them as cartoons or TV shows or movies, even better. I didn't make these stories just to monopolize them and keep them to myself. Whatever opportunities other people have to experience them and enjoy them, that would be fantastic.
You have such a nice attitude. Please keep that attitude for the future. And for that, what's the future for you? What's the future of indie comics? When I say indie comics, when I was 12, it meant Charlton, it meant Gold Key, it meant a periphery there, but they were still a corporation. Now, when we say indie comics, yes, you're right. We think Image, we think Dark Horse. What's the future like? What if I say indie comics in 20 years? What do you think we're going to see?
I think that you can never defeat the idea of people telling stories. It's been going on forever. As long as we have a documented history of the species, people have been telling stories, and some of those have been so timeless that we're still familiar with Homer and the Iliad, and we're just like, he told these stories thousands of years ago. We still know them now. They're still documented. People will always want to tell stories, and comic books are one of the easiest ways to do it. If you have paper, if you have a pencil, if you have a pen, nothing can stop you, and you can tell whatever stories you want to tell. I think that comic books will continue to exist in one form or another. And I think that the future of it is that more and more people will realize that they can participate and that they can be part of the process. Advances in technology have allowed people to sidestep gatekeepers in so many different industries. And whether it's people making movies on their cell phone, or whether it's making comic books that go directly on the internet that don't need to go to stores, I think that we are giving the tools to the creators, and the creators are able to do it without a dependence on other people, without the dependence on a corporate structure. And so I think going forward, the independent comic will survive. It will thrive in one form or another. I'm not a futurist, and I can't predict everything, but I know that people in my generation and the generations that will follow will always want to tell stories. They'll have cool ideas that they'll want to share with other people. I think that's just a natural human thing.
You mentioned Homer in there, and it sparked a thought which I've had with many comic artists on this level. There's a book called Our Heroes Wear Spandex, and it talks about the transcendence of the hero's journey in terms of comic books. Do you see 500, 1,000, 5,000, whatever time period, you think one day Spider-Man, Frankenrocker, Batman, we're looking at, I won't say gods, but I'll say, are we looking at a new pantheon? Are we looking at another set of Zeus and Freya, and are we looking at new gods?
I mean, I think comparable. If you want to take a look, what was the need for those original pantheons, those original gods? People, I think, like to tell stories or imagine stories where forces greater than themselves are at work. And if you want to tell stories about larger than life characters, superheroes fulfill a lot of the same requirements that those original, Zeus and Hera and Apollo and Ares, and I think they're comparable, and I think they do a lot of the same work. If you want to say it's a modern mythology, I don't think you'd be that far off. I don't think it's an overreach. I don't think it's a stretch. And are we going to see it 5,000 years from now? I think with the success of these Marvel movies and the proliferation, like the cultural impact that it's had, the cultural footprint that Marvel movies currently have on our global population, I think is strong enough that you could argue 5,000 years from now, people will still be familiar with it. To me, it's not really that important whether we remember things 5,000 years from now. I'm not going to be around at that point. I think let's all enjoy what we're doing right now, and let's do it to the best of our ability, and let's get as much satisfaction out of a job well done and a story well told. And if it survives 5,000 years from now, that'd be fantastic, and let's be thankful for it. But I think that there's a certain amount of arrogance in presuming that any story you tell will be valued and treasured 5,000 years from now. I don't even think that the stories I tell will be valued and treasured next week, but that's irrelevant. What I want to do is make the stories, tell the stories, enjoy the process, work with cool people doing it. And I feel like I'm doing something creative and artistic and valuable and productive with my time. If it finds an audience, even better. If it's an audience that remembers it in perpetuity, well, I mean, that's fantastic. But those are all well beyond my expectations. I just like making comics, and I've made comics that nobody's ever read, and that has never upset me. Like, I just like the fact of making them. And if you continue to approach it that way, and if you do it that way, I'll never be disappointed. Like, if I like making comics and then I make a comic, then I'll be happy about it. If I make a comic and I expect 20 people to read it and only 19 do, then I'm going to have problems because I can't control that. That's outside of my determination. So I just like making them. I think it's fun. I've always enjoyed making them. I continue to make them. I'm fortunate to be in a position where I get to do it, and I hope to keep doing it in the future.
That's great. That's great. I admire you. I'm gonna I have to look at things from your perspective, which I think is like the epitome of being an independent artist. You're opening your heart, you're handing your creativity to the world, and whoever takes it. If nothing else, you have handed this creativity to the world. Roel, thank you. You gave me a history lesson. You gave me the business model. There's so many times I talk to indie artists and indie producers and whatever, and I'll hear only one side. You gave me the whole works. So now the next time I see a comic book that's not already a movie, then I'll know what went into that. It's a pleasure to speak to you. Are you going to be at the Boston Sci-Fi event?
I'm going to make every effort to be there. I have a lot of scheduling conflicts that revolve around the fact that, I have a lot of responsibilities. And so I'm going to do everything I can to be there. Is my hope to be there. So fingers crossed that I'm able to clear up my schedule.
Well, if I don't see you, then when I head over to Kamikaze, and I know I'll be there, I am going to look for Frankenrocker, and I'm going to buy every issue that they have of it there.
Yeah, so I appreciate it.
Thanks. I can't wait to read it.
Thanks for talking to me. I appreciate it. It's been a true pleasure. And, hopefully I'll catch up with you when you're in Boston.
For sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jay. Appreciate it.